John wrote in his first letter, "This is the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith." So I've been tossing faith and how faith can be the victory for us in our lives, how we put faith into practice in our lives, as I've reflected on this text by the Apostle Paul. As you may know, in some of the denominations in the Presbyterian Church, there's some recommended, suggested readings for each week. It's called the lectionary. Today's lectionary New Testament reading is this one that Lois just read from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. So again, I've thought a lot about how does faith shape the way we live our lives each and every day. And I've appreciated the Because He Lives, because Gloria Gaither wrote that song in the late 60s as she was either pregnant with her second child or just delivered her second child. And it was a time in the United States when there were the civil rights movement, there was the Vietnam War, there was a lot going on in the world, as there always is, and Bill was having some health issues, and she was worried about bringing this child, her new child, into this crazy world in which we live. And then she says how sweet it is to hold a newborn baby and to know that that child can face uncertain days because Jesus Christ lives. So that was her faith that guided her as she looked to the future. The only way she could continue was because of her faith. So I learned a lesson about faith some years ago when I was visiting the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I was visiting, working with some missionaries there. And I was thinking about it. Do I need to be at the microphone? So I was thinking about being there in the Congo with these missionaries and watching the way we were with Christian Africans who were worshiping. I went to worship and I got a chance to speak through a translator. But watching these folks just filled with joy, worship God because of God's love and God's grace, and getting a chance to experience worship with them, which went on for hours in a thatched roof chapel, sitting on dirt floors, people who had next to nothing, and yet their worship, their joy was just contagious, just praising the Lord for what God had done for them in Jesus Christ. And it was faith, their faith, that gave them the victory over not having anything. So fast forward just a couple of weeks ago, I went to a church meeting. I'm a representative to our church's synod, and I went to a church meeting, and of course, before all those meetings, they have coffee and donuts ahead of time. You can go, and I was thinking, well, I'll go ahead of time, and I will sit down somewhere and get to meet some of the people and talk to some of the people. So I go in there. I brought a couple of show and tell items, but I go in there and get my coffee, and I look around. There were round tables. People were seated at round tables all around the room, and I go in there and look for a seat to sit in. And as I looked around the room, I did not see one person talking to anybody else. As I looked around the room, everyone was in this, just mesmerized by their cell phones. And I thought, jeepers creepers, here we are in modern America. How does modern technology distract us from our relationship with God? How does modern technology distract us from our relationship with each other? The other show and tell item that I failed to mention is that in the Congo, I brought a roll of duct tape. In the Congo, this is special. Everything is put together with duct tape. I watch kids playing out on the soccer field with a ball that was made of duct tape. And that's what they have. And they are, the folks that I worked with were happy because their faith was helping them deal with the challenges and the trials and the difficulties of life. So back to what the Apostle Paul has to say in this text. He began by saying, "It is written, I believed, therefore I have spoken." Again and again and again, Paul's faith gives him the victory. And here in the beginning of this passage, he talks about his proclamation of the good news of Jesus Christ. He quotes from Psalm 116, verse 10, "Therefore I believed, therefore I have spoken." Back in Psalm 116, the psalmist has been through a period of adversity, trials, difficulties, tests, hard times, but God brought him through, and God was faithful. And because of that, he was able to proclaim God's goodness. Paul, as you know, had been through all kinds of trials. Just like, well, actually not just like us, he was through trials far greater than we might ever conceive of. So I was going to read later in his letter to the Corinthians, second letter to the Corinthians, he writes, I thought I had it marked. In his second letter to the Corinthians, he writes this, he says, "I've been in prison more frequently. I've been flogged more severely. I've been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false brothers. I've labored and toiled and have gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and have gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face the daily pressure of my concern for all the churches." And back in chapter 4, he says, "We are hard pressed on every side, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but we're not in despair. We're persecuted, but we're not abandoned. We're struck down, but we're not destroyed." How can Paul talk like that? It is his faith that gives him the victory. He says this, "With this same spirit of faith, we believe and therefore speak because we know that the one who raised Jesus Christ from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you in his presence." Paul's faith was grounded in the power of Christ's resurrection from the dead. Paul's faith was grounded in the power of God's work in his life. Paul's faith was grounded in all that God had done for him. So he could proclaim, in spite of all the suffering, in spite of all the trials, in spite of all the difficulties, his proclamation was God's faithfulness and grace in Jesus Christ. And he says, I'm doing that so that God's grace can be shared for the glory of God. Paul had a purpose that was greater than himself. He realized his purpose was not in honoring himself, but his purpose was grounded in the fact that he was loved by God, he was valued by God, he was secure in God, and God had a plan and a purpose for his life. In the midst of his suffering, in the midst of his trials, it was faith that gave him the victory and enabled him to proclaim good news. that there is good news in a world filled with despair and heartache. So it's always a challenge to think about. We live in a world where a lot of folks that you deal with, that you talk to each and every day, are dealing with hopelessness. They're dealing with despair. Sooner or later, all of us know someone who's lost a son or a daughter or a friend through suicide because of their hopelessness and their despair. Do we have, like Paul, a faith that can give us that proclamation of good news to a world filled with hopelessness and despair? Well, Paul goes on to talk about priorities and how faith shapes our priorities. So I was thinking about this, thinking about my son recently, and how when my son was in high school, maybe you can remember these days when your priorities were a little bit different and how your priorities may have changed over your lives. But when my son was in high school, he had the lead in all the high school musicals and everything. He said, "Dad, when I finish high school, I'm going to study fine arts theater." And he says, "I'm going to be a great actor. I want to make a lot of money. I want to make a name for myself. I want to make a lot of money. I want to have all those nice things that I see the Hollywood stars have, the nice cars, the big mansions, all that great stuff." Well, my son is a high school teacher now. And he's an elder in his church. He's making a difference in people's lives. At church, he's making a difference in young people's lives, in school. But he's not making a whole lot of money. But he's happy because he's realized that there are more important things in life than making a whole lot of money and having the big homes and driving the fancy cars. It's sad, back to this, how technology kind of shapes our priorities. Google and technology and social media tell us what's important. They tell us what we need to be happy in life. They tell us what we should be afraid of. This kind of guides our thinking, our attitudes, our priorities. But we read in Psalm 130 where the psalmist says, "Put your hope in God's word." God's got a different message, that everything that the social media says is important, and everything that social media says needs to be a priority in our lives isn't necessarily so. Jesus said, "The world may pass away, but my word will not pass away." God's got a different message for us. And so Paul has a different set of priorities. He realizes that these earthly bodies that we live in are not going to last forever. In spite of what all the commercials tell us about what we can do with our hair and how we can make our skin perfect forever, or how we can get a Peloton machine and keep us fit forever, we're not going to live forever. He says, outwardly, these bodies of ours are wasting away. And I don't need to tell any of you that. We all know these bodies of ours are wasting away. Every year I go by, I realize I have more and more aches and pains, more and more doctor's appointments. Outwardly, he says, we're wasting away. But inwardly, we're being renewed day by day. What was that inward renewal? That's his faith that gives him the victory. That inward renewal of knowing again that he's loved and he's valued and he's secure in God's care. Knowing that he has a purpose in his life that's greater than himself. It's not just about me, Paul, he's writing. It's not just about any of us. Outwardly, we're wasting away. Inwardly, we are being renewed day by day because we know that our light and momentary troubles, the stuff that we deal with in this world is just temporary, is achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Paul saw his life and what he did in his service to God as an investment in eternity. That he served a purpose bigger than himself, We live in a world where people serve a purpose that's very small. They're serving themselves. Paul says, I have a purpose that's bigger than myself. We have a purpose in Jesus Christ. These light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory. I thought about that this week. 80th celebration, or 80th, not celebration, but remembrance of D-Day. And thought about those young men dying on the shores of Normandy who were not doing it for themselves, but they were making an investment for their families, for their nation, for the world, for something, a cause bigger than themselves. And in Jesus Christ, we have a cause bigger than ourselves. These light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory. So, we fix our eyes. Where are our priorities? Not on what is seen, the money, the power, the fame, the name, all that, the stuff, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary. What is unseen is eternal. Jesus said, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. The Apostle Paul said something interesting that I like to think about. He says, tell those folks, he's writing to Timothy, tell those folks who are rich in this world not to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. So Paul says God gives us so much. God gives us bounty. God gives us so much to enjoy. But that stuff is not an end in itself. Where are our priorities? What is important to us? Where do we find out what's important? Google or God's Word? It was his faith in God and God's love for him that shaped his priorities. It was his faith that gave him the victory over making things of this world his priority. And finally, Paul lived in hope because he trusted God's promises. Remember what Jesus said the night before he was crucified, as his disciples were troubled about him going away and not knowing where he was going and all of that. He says, don't let your hearts be troubled. Don't be afraid. Trust God. Trust me. In my Father's house, there's plenty of room. If it were not so, I would have told you, I am going to prepare a place for you. That's a message for each and every one of us, as well as his disciples back in the first century. Do we live in hope? Paul says, remember, Paul was a tent maker. He concluded that passage that we looked at. When these earthly tents have been destroyed, these tents built by human beings. Paul was a tent maker. He knew tents didn't last forever. He knew that weather and wind and so forth would destroy the fabric and so forth. Just as these bodies that we live in now, when this earthly tent has been destroyed, we have a heavenly home built by God, eternal in the heavens. And that was Paul's hope. And Paul placed his hope in God's promises. As a Navy guy, I love the passage in Hebrews where the author of Hebrews says, because of God's promises, we have this hope as an anchor for our souls, firm and secure. It's our hope in God's promises that gives us an anchor in this life and faith that will be the victory in the midst of the turmoil. We live in a world filled with turmoil. We lived in a world filled with uncertainty. We all know that. We get up in the morning. We read about it in social media. We read about it in the papers. We hear about it on the radio. It's everywhere. There's so much negativism. But can we live in hope? because of our faith in what God is doing. Everything made by man is destined to come to an end sometime. But God offers us the promise of a home, an eternal home that will not wear away, will not fade away. God promises that for us. Share a little insight from a book I think has been helpful for me in thinking about my priorities and thinking about my faith and thinking about what's important in my life. It's written by a guy named Scott Roden, called Stewards of the Kingdom. And Scott Roden is a pastor, and he says, I go to a lot of funerals. And I find it's interesting to listen to eulogies. He says, no one, when a person dies and we remember someone, no one ever talks about how much money that guy made, or how big a house that person lived in, or what kind of cars that person drove. People will talk about the difference that this individual made in their lives, the difference that this individual made in the community, the difference this individual made in his church or with his faith or whatever it is. And he says it's interesting that we spend our lives sometimes, many people spend their lives building an earthly kingdom, building their money, building their name, building whatever it is that is insignificant when they die. He talks about having an eternal vision. And that's what Paul speaks of here when he says that we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but as on what is unseen, because we know when this earthly tent has been destroyed, we have a heavenly home built by God, eternal in the heaven. So the question that I wrestle with, and the question I want to challenge you with to think about is this: does my faith mean anything to me when the rubber really meets the road? Does my faith enable me to share good news to folks that are dealing with hopelessness and despair in this world in which I live? Does my faith shape my priorities, the way I look at the world, the things that I want for myself, the things that I want for my family? Does my faith shape those priorities? And does my faith enable me to live in hope? You've heard the sayings, that person is so heavenly minded that he's no earthly good. Well, that was not Paul. Paul was heavenly minded. He had a vision for the future. But that vision, that faith, shaped the way he lived each and every day. Does your faith in what God has done for you in Jesus Christ mean anything for you this day, for you, the way you look at the future, the way you look at our world, the way you look at your priorities in life? Question to think about this week: does my faith give me victory? Amen.